Well, Bessel, I'm so delighted that you'll be one of the speakers at Psychedelic Science 2025 from
Yeah,
June
looking forward to
16th
it.
to
Yeah,
the 20th in Denver, and that you'll also be offering a workshop there, as
yeah.
well as speaking. And what I'm really delighted to talk to you about today is that you were the principal investigator of the Boston site on phase 3. And maybe if you want to share a bit about what your first thoughts were about how we should be careful of working with people with um, childhood trauma, with
Yes,
attachment trauma,
indeed.
and how
I
in the
warned you guys, don't take people who don't suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and exclude people who have always been traumatized and don't have a memory of what it feels like to be safe. And so in other studies I've done, uh, if you were abused within your family, you never really felt safe with anybody, treatment generally didn't work. And that's true for a lot of people we see in our practices. That uh, possibly, I don't know exact data on that, but in my practice, certainly the majority of the people I see have had long-standing, ongoing trauma, and really don't know what it feels like to be safe with somebody. And I warned you guys, exclude those people because you're stacking the deck against you. And you guys overruled me. Sometimes it's really good to overrule people. Um, and the other thing that I was worried about, I didn't share it with you, is that our team of clinicians was so great that I thought the that the clinical care would trump the MDMA condition, and that you would barely see a difference because the clinicians were so great. And so what's so great about doing research is you may have an idea in your head, and then it shows you, hey, you were wrong. And what was so striking is that uh, 80, like about 80%, 78, 88, something percent of our sample, total sample of the study, had ongoing childhood abuse, which is the most recalcitrant population and a population that generally sort of limps along, and they benefit from good psychotherapy, but that internal sense of defectiveness and there's something fundamentally wrong with me has a very hard time disappearing. And you guys put me in charge of the so-called secondary data of the study, which to my mind are the primary data, because I'm not really a great fan of the DSM. It's really not a scientific manual. And what I'd like to say is that John McCain and John Kerry, who are both Vietnam veterans, probably have about the same PTSD score as the homeless man down the street from me. So PTSD doesn't really capture the complexity of what people suffer from. But you added some data about self-compassion and self-regulation.
well, let's say that Bessel, you actually recommended some of these measures, these secondary
Good, I
measures,
did.
as the condition for working with people that had childhood trauma. You wanted to look at some of these other
Exactly.
aspects.
Exactly.
So maybe you
Because,
could describe the measures. That would be.
well, see, but what we know from prior research is that if you have alexithymia, in other words, if you have no words for your internal experience and you cannot describe what motivated you to do something or how you feel inside, you just feel like crap, but can't say anything else. Uh, it's very hard to do treatment because you have no words to observe yourself with. And uh, generally, so it's been shown that if you have alexithymia, people generally don't benefit from treatment. The other thing that really goes against benefiting from treatment is if you just hate yourself and you think you're basically a defective person and you're filled with shame, then it is very hard to fess up to what you're feeling. And so that's a major obstacle to getting better. And the third thing is, in order to deal with your trauma, you need to have a capacity to keep yourself more or less calm in order to visit what happened in the past. But what we see a lot in traumatized people is that the moment they start talking about their trauma, their whole body starts reliving the trauma, and that makes it impossible to take the distance necessary to process it. And so we put some measures in the study about alexithymia, self-regulation, self-compassion, things like that. And to my mind, those were the big changes. The changes that make it impossible for people to come to terms with their trauma are core psychological capacities. And I'm so glad we measured them. And so MDMA changes self capacities. And so I would have thought that our lovely therapists, who are really very caring and good people, would give people a self compassion, sense of self compassion. Not so much. And so no matter how nice people are to you, that deep feeling of being a damaged piece of good doesn't really go away. And I've seen it in my own patients also. They feel apologetic about it, say, "Oh, I'm sorry I failed you, but I still feel like a piece of shit." So I'm sorry, I'm sorry I failed you because I really tried to make you not feel like a piece of shit, but you still do, even though you know that I love and admire you. And then, but turned out that MDMA flipped the switch. And that we saw that over and over again in the treatment, that when people inadvertently, so automatically, a lot of trauma came up, and MDMA people gave people the capacity to go like, "Oh, that poor kid! I was only 3 years old, and oh, I feel it now. What happened to that 3 year old? Oh, I feel so bad for that 3 year old that that kid had to go through that back then." And but to my mind, MDMA did, it put a timeline in people's minds.
Mhm.
Some people talk about neurobiology, which I think a lot of the talk about neurobiology I call biobabble. They're just, you know, another way of not knowing something. But seeing that sense of time coming online, you go like, what happens in the brain? That the brain now is able to say, that was then, and this is now, which is the critical issue in overcoming trauma. To be able to say, yes, it happened, but it happened back then. It's not happening right now. And there was something about MDMA that made it possible for people to really make a distinction between that's what happened then, and it's awful, and oftentimes people have very painful and upsetting experiences during the MDMA experience. As you know, I've told you that before. I'd never taken MDMA before, and when I lied on Michael Mithofer's couch to be prepared to be the PI of this little part of the study, I thought I'd be looking forward to have great experiences. And I lied there for an hour, coming out and be getting in touch with all kind of miserable stuff inside myself. So this is not a great trip always. And I would say almost none of our patients had just great trips.
Right.
They really went into very dark places, but after they went there, say, yes, it happened, and it's over. And that to me is the miracle of probably psychedelics. I'm also intrigued that it looks like different psychedelic substances all have that capacity, even though they're completely different chemical substances.
Yeah. Now you were
Yeah.
connected and studied with Dr. Bastiaans back in the Netherlands.
Well, I didn't study with him.
Oh,
I was his receptionist.
ah,
I was
ah,
a first year medical student. And so I never saw him work, except he is part of the reason why I became a psychiatrist, because at one point a chauffeur-driven car came to the place, now Eric Vermetten's place, and the chauffeur carried this woman out of the car. She was paralyzed. And an hour later, the woman walked outside of his office. I said, wow, psychiatry can make the lame walk. I want to become a psychiatrist too. I've never made a lame person walk, but Bastian's.
wow. Well, the reason I mentioned that for those
Yeah,
people who are listening, Dr. Bastiaans was really the first one ever that worked with a psychedelic for
yeah,
post-traumatic stress disorder. He called it concentration camp
yeah, yeah,
syndrome, and he was working with LSD. And he wrote, did some incredible work. He was the last person in the world that still had legal permission to work with LSD
right,
into the 80s. And he did incredible work with what we would now call PTSD
right,
with LSD. And he's been a big inspiration. But I
yeah.
think that there are major differences between LSD for trauma and
Yeah.
MDMA for trauma.
And also the sad thing with Bastian's is he did this amazing work, and I don't know precisely what happened because I was already living here. Um, he was a very powerful man, and he fell off his pedestal, and because his records weren't good enough.
Right.
And he was a very powerful man. Everybody's a little bit afraid of him because of such an important person. But at the end, he did not harvest any gratitude or real acclaim. I wish we could posthumously sort of send some messages to him and say, yes, we really know what good work you did, because uh, his end was not good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he was much more focused on actually treating people than on doing the research to speak to others about it.
Yeah.
For those that are interested, there's a book called Shaviti, A Vision, Shivitti, by Kotsetnik, which is a number for the concentration camp survivors. And that's about a Holocaust survivor and writer who went to do LSD with Dr. Bastian's. And it's a
Oh, I don't know
very
that.
moving account about his treatment.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
your inspiration was in part to become a psychiatrist from Dr. Bastian?
that was actually, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wow. Wow. Could
And
you
I
say a
knew he
bit?
was doing something with drugs, but this was like 1965. No, yeah, 65. So it's a long time ago. And the psychedelic revolution hadn't quite started in widespread in America at that point. It's probably
Yeah.
about the time that you first took LSD yourself.
I first took LSD in 1971. So
You're a
it was a long
latecomer.
time. Yes, I'm a latecomer. Could you speak a little bit more about the plus one paper? So the paper that you um,
Yeah,
wrote about the secondary measures that you'll be talking about at the Psychedelic Science Conference.
yeah. You know, um, my regret is that I wrote it too much in scientese. It's
Ah,
actually
yes.
very boring papers. You need to really wade through it. Um, because I wanted to be respectable. I wanted to have it in a good neuroscience journal. So it's a bit of a tough read, but it really spells out how the things that keep people from being able to process the trauma, um, namely getting hijacked by the trauma and feeling that trauma without being able to observe it, um, and this self-hatred and this inability to know what's going on inside of you, are the things that have been identified as the most important factors that get in the way of people recovering from that trauma. We all have bad experiences in our lives, but they don't become a trauma because our brain continues to be able to process it and slowly get to realize, boy, that was really tough and I felt really hurt, but thank God it's over. But if you don't get the perspective, if every time you think about your trauma, it comes back and you feel it on a sensory level, and sometimes on a motoric level, that certainly is what got me into PTSD in the first place, that instead of talking about the trauma, people acted out their trauma. Instead of saying, you scare me, they started to attack people. Instead of saying, you scare me, they ran away from people. And so it was all action, all sensation, but no mentation.
Mm.
And so what MDMA clearly is able to do, it allows people to observe and to stay in the observing part. And I must say that I think the role of the therapist is to help people to observe. I don't think that the therapist said anything that was particularly helpful, but their presence and their commitment, and sometimes their touch, gentle touch, said, it's okay, we're here, we're with you. I gave, I actually, on my new book, my last chapter is, it's almost finished, is on courage.
Ah,
What's the nature of courage? Huh? And you need to have a lot of courage to deal with your trauma. And
right.
then I'm still working on it. How do you give people the courage to visit the most painful thing in their lives? And clearly, MDMA gives people courage,
Well,
not in a foolish way, but in a mindful way.
yeah. Now you've used the phrase a couple times to process the trauma.
Yeah,
Could you say a bit more about what it means to process rather than just to sort of reenact or re-experience? Something is
yeah.
processed. How do you see that?
The processing is really putting it in its perspective, saying, yeah, I was 4 years old and um, my older brother was out of control and he beat me up, and my parents should have known what he was doing, but they turned a blind eye on me, and I was tortured for 2 years by my brother. And that poor kid, and instead of feeling like that kid, only you go like, boy, that was really bad for this kid. If this would happen to me today, I would take action, I would do some, but when I was 4 years old, I couldn't do so. It's really the processing is the comparison with what you're capable of are of right now and what you couldn't do back then. And
Mhm.
so what often happens in trauma that people hate themselves for not standing up for themselves or not running away or staying around with an abuser. And they apply their current mental functioning to what they must have been able to do when they're 3, 4, or 5 years old. And on MDMA, you get to really feel, I really know as a 4 year old, I didn't know how to do that. I needed help at that point. I needed help from a person like me. Because I today I would know how to do that,
Yeah.
but back then I didn't. And you get this timeline perspective. That is really a marvel to behold. Yeah.
Wow. There's something else I wonder if you've seen much of this, which is that sometimes on MDMA, people can see the abuser as themselves acting from pain and acting from their own prior abuse that they received.
It's one of the most remarkable things. I think part of the difficulty people have with the trauma notion is that we go back to blaming it on somebody. And so people who don't know about trauma really say, oh, you're just trying to find somebody to blame. But this is the opposite. But it's so remarkable. People say, my father used to beat me up. My father did that. My mother turned a blind eye. And then they go with, they say, I feel so sorry for my dad not seeing, not that he didn't see what a marvelous little kid he had. And that he repeated the trauma that happened to him. And his own family became just as miserable as the family he came from. And he never got to have the experience of what it's like to have kids taking it in how your kids love you. And I see this over and over again. It's remarkable how this
Yeah.
connection spreads out to your perpetrators.
It's incredible. Yeah. And I think that there's a way in which this, I wouldn't say it's quite forgiveness, but it's more understanding of.
Yeah. Yeah, it is forgiveness, but to my mind, forgiveness is a bit of a superficial term. Like, I won't hold it against you.
Mhm.
And this goes much deeper. Like, oh, I wish you had felt the love that I had for you back then. And I feel so sorry that you couldn't feel what a beautiful little kid you had, because now I know what a beautiful little kid I was. And I had all this love to give, but you weren't there to take it. I'm so sorry, because it would have made you much happier if you'd been able to do that. Like,
But
and these are complex mental processes, and it's so rich.
yeah. Here's another kind of question, which is absolutely astonishing, is that your book, The Body Keeps the Score, was written quite a while ago, published quite a while ago, and still it's in the New York Times bestselling list. So can you sort of, how do you understand that?
I really don't understand it. It is not like, oh, look at me, I wrote this amazing book. It's like, isn't it amazing that so many people read it? What's also intriguing to me is that, I'm 80 years old. My whole mental life was formed by the Second World War, the Nazis, um, growing up among Holocaust survivors, having people come back from Japanese concentration camps to the colonies, coming to America, being active in the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. That is really my developmental route. 95% of the people who read my book have nothing in common with that. They were born after the Vietnam War and
Yeah.
after the Holocaust, and it doesn't mean very much to them. And I'm really astounded. Isn't it amazing that I wrote a book that comes out of my timeline that people can relate to? And I'm just amazed by it and grateful for it. And I think part of the success of the book is that I do talk about neuroscience, and I know a fair amount about neuroscience, and that people then feel like it's respectable. But the main thing I see from people is they say, I feel validated. I've always felt crazy, and now I really understand what is going on with me. I mean, it's really amazing. I meet people, at least 3 people per week, who say, "You saved my life." And they don't go, "Oh, I saved your life." It's really like, that is so amazing like, that you were able to relate to this book so that it could really help you. But it don't feel like it comes from me. It comes from the spirit having helped me to write a book that was very helpful to people.
Well, can you say a little bit about what you felt was unsaid that has left you now to write a new book?
Uh, well, I, I was asked, when you write a successful book, people always putting pressure on to write another one. Um, and but I really got into, I wanted to write more about the body and how we are inhabit a body. And so we started to write a workbook on how to work with the body and with somatic experience. One of my earlier pieces of research was actually the first scientific study on yoga. After 5,000 years of doing yoga, I did some brain scans, I did some outcome stuff, and we really showed that if you change your relationship to your body, your relationship to your trauma becomes better. And so the next book is all about interoceptive awareness and how to really befriend your bodily sensations, basically. And I see our culture sort of moving slightly in that direction.
Hmm.
Uh, When I remember I was just in Australia again, and I was in Melbourne. And the first time I was in Melbourne it was the year 2000. I was my reputation was high, and therefore the first time I introduced the notion that trauma lives in the body. I left that meeting, and nobody was talking to me. They all said he's really gone off the deep end. He's talking about his body stuff. No, it's a mental issue, and he's trying to draw attention to himself. He's an idiot. And now in 2025, nobody gives me an argument, yeah, you live it in your body. So somehow the culture has changed and has accepted my point of view in many ways, which is nice. Yeah.
And it's changing in terms of psychedelics as well, to seeing that
Yeah.
they have incredible potential for healing.
Yeah, and also, and it was also important, the whole issue of touch and movement in psychedelics, extremely complicated. And you and I know how comforting touch is can be very important when you go through difficult experiences because touch is a primary way in which we feel calm. But then it's since few of us are trained in body-oriented stuff, it may go wrong, and then boundaries get crossed, and so we have taken a position justifiably you should never touch. But if you never touch, you also deprive people of a source of great comfort. And it can be extremely comforting for somebody to hold your arm, for somebody to hold your feet while you go through things. It gives you a great sense of comfort. Um, and how we're going to work that out, I'm not sure yet. And what's great about the study I did for you guys is that we had videotapes, so we could really
Yeah.
track how much touch there was and how helpful it was. But it continues to be really a major issue that we haven't really quite settled yet.
Yeah, I think there are researchers that have wanted to review the videotapes to really catalog all the different kinds of touch and
Yeah,
then try to develop some sort of a sense of which ones seem to be the most productive or which ones are
yeah.
not productive or over the line. And that's something that still remains to be done.
Yeah, we know very little about it actually. So my foundation that tries to promote research now in things that we don't know yet, we funded a big study on touch
Oh,
that
well,
we may hear about at this year's conference, actually, our trauma conference, because I think understanding what the touch does to traumatized people is very important, and we don't know this at this point. Huh? For for me, when the people who I love touch me, it's very great. But if you're an incest survivor, touch may become very scary for you. And so understanding what touch can do and with whom touch is helpful is something we really need to learn still. We have a lot to learn about it. Yeah.
yeah, it's very well. I just really am so grateful that you're coming to Psychedelic Science and sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And there'll be thousands and thousands of people there that are
The credit
really